Are you talking to the police in Sweden? How much do they know?
لا تنتظري، تعالي التجئي إلى الدولة الإسلامية.
Listen, this Raqqa thing is fake. They fooled us. These things happen.
Everything she's told me is true, I'm sure of it.
I'm going to die. I'm going to die.
Hello, and welcome to Quick Hits, podcast brought to you by Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada. I'm your host, Phil Gurski, president of Borealis, and this is a follow-up to the previous Quick Hits in a series that I am basically entitling a review of Caliphate, which is a Netflix series put out by a Swedish production agency on Islamic State and possibly terrorism in Sweden. So this is a review of episode number 2. Again, in keeping with the first episode, I want to look at how the episode unfolded, what was said about terrorism, what was said about ISIS, what was said about security intelligence, and weigh in on how well I thought it was portrayed, how accurate it was, and whether or not there were liberties being taken with the whole notion of counterterrorism. Episode 2 starts with a presentation in Belgium on an individual who is essentially outlining or underscoring the acts of genocide carried out by Islamic State. He refers to a couple of structures destroyed in Mauritania, in Egypt, and in Iraq and Syria. And this is completely consistent with ISIS. ISIS did engage in genocide against a whole number of people, not just in Iraq and Syria. The building in Mauritania is referred to as probably a Sufi shrine, and we do know that Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, whatever they call themselves these days, did in fact destroy buildings that belonged to other sects of Islam that they didn't agree with. Attacks in Egypt, ISIS in the Sinai, the group that's fighting there, has engaged in several acts of terrorism against Coptic Christians, including beheading them, because of course they view Coptic Christians as kuffar, despite the fact that in the Quran, Christians are seen as Ahl Kitab, which is Arabic for people of the book. And finally, of course, the whole notion of the Yazidis is one that everyone knows quite well. And interestingly, just in Germany these days, there is a trial going on in Frankfurt of a 27-year-old man who is accused of being part of ISIS, and he has been charged with genocide in relation to the Yazidis. So the fact that Caliphate has chosen, at least in its initial scenes in episode 2, to highlight ISIS involvement in genocide against humanity is completely accurate and completely in keeping with what we know about the terrorist group.
We have to go to... It was a drone. There could be another one. We have to go to the shelter,
Are you afraid of dying?
You know where it is, right?
Oh, Ma, I can't. We have to go to the shelter.
Pull yourself together.
Oh, Ma, can't we?
Take it easy, Husam.
We have to go to the shelter.
Husam,
we have to go.
sit back down. Husam, come on,
what are you doing?
Come back. Husam, come back. Someone's back.
I'll move on now to this character of Ibbe, who is a young man, appears to be Egyptian, and in episodes 2 we see him continuing his recruiting and grooming of young women with whom he's in school in Sweden. He's showing them videos, he's showing them links, he's teaching one Sule, short for Suleka, how to pray. She comes from a secular family, a secular Muslim family, hasn't prayed since she was a child. He bought her a hijab, and essentially what Ibbe is trying to do is poison the minds of these young women. I'm guessing, and we'll see what happens in later episodes, I'm guessing that he's doing so to convince them to travel to Iraq and Syria and become ISIS brides. That's just a guess on my part. We'll see if I'm right. Sule is drinking the Kool-Aid. She definitely is starting to hate Sweden. She expresses a lot of disgust at what she sees around her. She's expressing a lack of faith in the democratic system. Why bother voting? It doesn't change anything. She's expressing that Islamic law, Sharia law, should be superior to Swedish law. And it is now apparent that she is having fights with her parents, who again are very secular Swedes. And she goes as far as to praise the attackers of Charlie Hebdo. Now, this was an attack a couple years ago, 2016, I believe, against the satirical French newspaper Charlie Hebdo in Paris, which had featured a bunch of cartoons that some Muslims, actually a lot of Muslims, saw as insulting in nature. And terrorists targeted Charlie Hebdo for assassination. And in fact, an attack was carried out against one of their offices in Paris, and many people died. And so Sule is essentially agreeing that the men who carried out the terrorist attack were not terrorists, they were heroes. And you can see the tension with her family. I think this is very real. I certainly saw this in my career, whereby families had come to Canada to try to get away from all this kind of stuff, and sometimes their children reverted back, not just to the old ways, traditional ways, not just to the more fundamental sort of tenets of the faith, but were being drawn in by recruiters, by groomers, by influencers down a path of radicalization. So insofar as that really does happen, I think the producers did a good job of that.
Hands by your ears, and then down to the floor. You see? And then we say when we're down there, Subhan,
Subhan,
Rabbi,
Rabbi,
Al-Allah.
Al-Allah.
Perfect. Okay. Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar.
Ibbe is also trying to convince everyone that 9/11 was a CIA Mossad conspiracy. That's true. In fact, it's not just Muslim extremists who think 9/11 was fake. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories on the internet about what 9/11 really was. I find it interesting that we're talking about conspiracy theories with 9/11, and of course we're dealing with conspiracy theories about COVID-19, which is something else I'm going to be addressing in a later podcast not linked to this one. Ibbe has also continued to recruit these two white wankers, these two white guys that aren't very bright, and there's a short scene in which he's showing them how to use weapons. This in fact happened as well. A very famous case here in Canada, Toronto 18, back in 2005, 2006. They went out into Algonquin Park or around there, sort of north central Ontario during the wintertime over the Christmas period, and carried out weapons training. So the fact that these guys, it happens in wooded areas, outlying areas in Caliphate. It seems to happen in an old housing estate, an abandoned housing estate. So that is extremely true as well. Moving on to the relationship between Pervin and Husam. This is the couple in Syria. He's an ISIS fighter. She's there trying to care for her infant child. She really wants to come home, and she's working with Swedish intelligence. Husam is getting more and more paranoid. Not over the actions of his wife, but he seems to be having a real issue with ISIS. On the one hand, he's being told that he is a gift from God and God has something planned for him. On the other, he just jumps at every little explosion in the streets. And he's in a meeting with his ISIS friends, and they're asking him basically to find out information to further the Swedish plot. And I'll get back to that in a second. When a drone strike happens, he runs from the room where the meeting's being held, and another drone strike hits, and he's seriously injured and is taken back to Pervin. So Husam seems to be really torn between his desire to help Islamic State to be a good Muslim and the fact that he's very afraid of the violence, of the carnage that's happening around him. For her part, Pervin has been instructed by her SAEPO, the Swedish intelligence service handler, to find out more information about the so-called Swedish plot. She tries to get into Husam's computer, fails to do so. She does get access to his notebook, but his notebook, apparently she says her husband can't write, can't read the handwriting. So the SAEPO handler tries to get her to photograph the pages, and it turns out the photographs are so bad because the cell phone is so bad. The cell phone that Pervin has is an old-style cell phone that isn't working very well. So eventually, the handler calls her, and they start walking through the attack together, the attack planning, and Pervin finds out that a fertilizer bomb is being built. There are references to flights from Baghdad to Arlanda, which is the main airport in Stockholm, mentions of C4, and it looks like a massive 500-kilogram bomb is going to be placed somewhere in Sweden at some point. I'll get back to Pervin at the end of this podcast. As far as SAEPO is concerned, what they're doing is there's a scene where they're showed a link chart, a big board where people's names and photos are placed on, and they're trying to ascertain the relationship between these individuals in Sweden, and that's very, very accurate. We used to do link charts all the time at CSIS. Who's who in the zoo, who reports to whom, who's important, and this is the only way you figure out whether what you've got is serious or whether you got a bunch of wannabe wankers that aren't capable of organizing a piss up in a bar. So the fact that they're doing this and trying to reconstruct the intelligence that they have with respect to the network in Sweden is an extremely accurate portrayal of what an intelligence service does. So kudos to the directors on that one too. We also find out that Kalle, which is a colleague of Fatima, one of the SAEPO agents, they're having a bit of a fling, it looks like. apparently was involved in another young lady from Sweden who they were trying to prevent from radicalizing, and it turns out they failed, and she ended up in Syria, and Kala has some kind of problem with what happened. This I find interesting. I'm not sure that a security service does de-radicalization or pre-radicalization or counter-radicalization, so I'm not sure how accurate that is, but I can't speak for SAEPO, the Swedish service. We didn't do any that kind of work at CSIS, I can assure you, not the best of my knowledge.
You know, they were glad and praised God when they attacked that paper in Paris, you know, Charlie Hebdo.
What's wrong with that? I think they were heroes. That whole thing was a violation of Islam. It degraded Muslims. It's a good thing they were killed.
Anyway, moving to the very end of the episode, this is really interesting. This is the da-da-da part. Pervin is just got off the phone with Fatima. She's told her about the fertilizer bomb. She's told her about the airports. And lo and behold, one of the other ISIS fighters comes into the room. She's given her husband Husam a sleeping draft so he won't wake up. But one of the other fighters, who appears to have a bit of an interest in her, finds her hanging up the phone. And he asked, "Who are you talking to?" End of episode. I can't wait for episode 3. So, again, I think so far, from what I've seen, the Caliphate is a fairly accurate rendition of Islamic State. It's a very accurate rendition of what a security service does to find out intelligence on plots in the homeland. And we'll see if as the series goes on, if it remains as accurate. So, I don't know, have you been watching the series? What do you think of it? I'd love to hear your feedback, either on what I think of it or your own independent thoughts of it. You can reach me always, as ever, on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @borealissaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. As usual, you can subscribe to all the content I provide on Borealis by going to my webpage, www.borealisthreatandrisk.com, hitting the subscribe button, filling in information, and you'll be sent an email on a daily basis with all the material, podcasts, perspectives, today in terrorism, quick hits, etc., etc. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.